This place should be demolished! The rage-filled scream shattered Pine Hollow's peaceful morning. Barbara Henderson, our nightmare HOA president, had just returned from 3 years in prison, and she was standing on my property like she still owned the place. My heart pounded as I watched her march toward me with that same entitled fury I remembered too well. She had no idea what she was walking into. After what she put us through, this was going to be beautiful. Comment below where you're watching from, because I'm about to show you exactly what happens when a HOA Karen messes with the wrong neighbor. The black SUV eased into our cul-de-sac, and I watched from the porch. Barbara stepped out like a general taking back ground, steel gray hair in that same severe bun. Her eyes swept the street, then snagged on my cedar cabin, the one she'd tried everything short of arson to erase. Her face tightened. She stared, jaw slack, as if the sight had stalked her for 3 years. In her private script, the cabin should have been gone. It wasn't. I kept my face neutral and sipped my coffee while she processed the sight. The woman who once measured my grass with a ruler was finding her thorn right where she left it. The cedar walls caught the sun, the preservation plaque shone, and the statutes guarding this place still outranked anything she ever waved around. For someone who built her identity on controlling every view in Pine Hollow, the cabin's survival read like a personal rebuke. The ankle monitor chirped the instant she hit the sidewalk, a plain reminder that someone else was keeping score. She glanced down, kept coming, and neighbors drifted out. Mrs. Patterson at the window, the Johnsons on their driveway, the new folks sensing the air pull taut. "Robert Mitchell!" she bellowed, jabbing a finger toward my cabin like she was issuing a formal challenge. "This eyesore was supposed to be condemned years ago. I filed the paperwork, I had the inspections scheduled, I did everything legally required." Barbara Henderson had never learned to speak to people, only to lecture them, command them, or threaten them with whatever authority she'd managed to accumulate. Standing on my property, violating the terms of her release, she was still trying to position herself as the victim of some vast conspiracy designed to thwart her righteous mission. 3 years in a concrete cell hadn't cured her extraordinary ability to ignore reality when it conflicted with her desires, and the electronic warnings from her ankle monitor meant nothing compared to her obsession with my cabin's continued existence. She stepped over my line like it wasn't there. "You should have been evicted," she shouted, pitching the neighborhood as neat, uniform, beautiful, without my eyesore. The words poured out, years in the making, while the monitor's beeps climbed to meet her voice. Officer Williams arrived within 60 seconds. The monitoring unit had been stationed 2 blocks away, waiting for exactly this scenario. His patrol car slid into position with smooth efficiency as Barbara whirled around, her face cycling through confusion, indignation, and dawning horror. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the property immediately," Williams called out, his hand resting casually on his radio. "You're in violation of your release conditions." Barbara's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air as reality finally penetrated her rage-induced tunnel vision. She'd been so focused on confronting me about my cabin's continued existence that she'd forgotten about the very real legal constraints governing her freedom. The takedown was swift and professional. Officer Williams moved with practiced efficiency, pinning Barbara face first into my rhododendron bushes before she could process what was happening. The ankle monitor finally fell silent as her GPS location was updated to "in custody," its job done with electronic precision. "This is harassment," she screamed into the mulch, dirt smearing across her cheek as she struggled against Williams' restraining grip. "He orchestrated this whole thing!" But her protests fell on deaf ears. The neighbors who'd gathered to watch were too busy exchanging relieved glances to spare any sympathy for Pine Hollow's former dictator getting a taste of actual consequences. Backup rolled in within minutes. Her parole officer stepped from an unmarked sedan with the paperwork ready, the look of someone who expected this day. The crowd watched in quiet relief, while Barbara's echoes of harassment and conspiracy bounced off the homes she used to patrol. As the patrol cars pulled away with Barbara secured in the back seat, Pine Hollow began to exhale collectively. The crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors lingering to exchange reassurances and share their disbelief at how quickly karma had caught up with their former tormentor. I remained seated on my porch steps, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the street return to its peaceful state. 3 years I'd waited for this moment, 3 years of preparation that Barbara knew nothing about. She thought she was returning to the same frightened community she'd left behind, the same vulnerable cabin she'd almost succeeded in destroying. But Barbara Henderson had no idea how much Pine Hollow had changed in her absence, or how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted while she'd been counting days in a prison cell. 3 years ago, Pine Hollow felt less like a neighborhood and more like a dictatorship dressed in bylaws. Barbara weaponized rules, rulers in the grass, midnight photos, $500 fines over mailbox paint, until fear did the patrolling. The one thing she never bent was my cabin. The cabin itself was Barbara's white whale, a 19th century cedar structure that had been standing in Pine Hollow long before the first subdivision was ever planned. When developers bought the surrounding land in the 1980s, they'd been required to preserve it as a historical landmark, complete with federal and state protections that made it untouchable by local ordinances. "This is a homeowner association, Mr. Mitchell," Barbara had announced during her first visit, waving a stack of violation notices. "Your little shack doesn't get special treatment." That's when I showed her the historical preservation plaque and explained that her authority ended at my property line. The look on her face was worth framing. Pure rage mixed with the dawning realization that something in her perfect suburban kingdom existed beyond her reach. What followed was 18 months of the most creative harassment campaign I'd ever witnessed. Barbara started with standard intimidation tactics: surprise inspections at dawn, citations for grass being a quarter-inch too tall, demands that I repaint everything to match neighborhood standards that existed only in her imagination. When those failed, she escalated to photographing my cabin from multiple angles at all hours, apparently hoping to document some violation that would give her leverage. "You can't hide behind those federal laws forever," she'd mutter while crouched in my bushes at 2 in the morning, measuring fence post distances with a tape measure. I'd wave from my window and she'd scramble away like a raccoon caught raiding garbage cans. The woman turned harassment into performance art. But what she didn't realize was that I'd been documenting everything right back. Every late-night photography session, every bogus citation, every threatening letter got filed away in a growing collection that would eventually become evidence. I installed security cameras around the entire property, not just the obvious ones, but hidden units that captured Barbara's increasingly unhinged behavior in high definition. "Smile, Barbara," I'd call out when I spotted her lurking near my mailbox. "You're on candid camera." She thought she was building a case against my cabin. Instead, she was creating an airtight case against herself, one frame at a time. Barbara's obsession with my property became the catalyst for Pine Hollow's collective awakening. Mrs. Patterson was the first to reach out after Barbara cited her for having non-regulation garden gnomes. "I thought I was going crazy," she whispered during our kitchen table meeting. She actually measured my gnomes with a ruler. The Johnsons joined our informal alliance after their $500 fine for choosing the wrong shade of black paint. Apparently, there were 17 approved blacks, and they'd chosen number 18. One by one, residents Barbara thought she was protecting started realizing they were actually her prisoners, and they began sharing security footage, coordinating documentation, and building an ironclad case that would finally put an end to her reign of terror. "We're not dealing with a power-hungry HOA president anymore," Sarah Johnson observed during one of our strategy sessions. "We're dealing with someone who's crossed the line into criminal behavior." She was right. Barbara had made the classic authoritarian mistake of believing that fear equals respect, that compliance means loyalty. She never understood that every person she terrorized was becoming a potential witness against her. Every family she threatened was gathering evidence for the day of reckoning that was rapidly approaching. The woman who'd demanded absolute control over every visible aspect of Pine Hollow had lost control over her own behavior, and we were all documenting her descent into madness. The incident that finally brought Barbara down was almost anticlimactic after months of escalating harassment. Frustrated with her inability to find any legitimate violations of my cabin, she decided to create some. I woke up one morning to find my front door painted with bright red graffiti reading, "Condemned by order of Pine Hollow HOA." Along with a fake citation claiming structural violations that would require immediate demolition. "Really, Barbara?" I said aloud, examining her handiwork while my security cameras recorded everything. "Vandalism and filing false government documents? That's a felony in this state." The problem was that my cameras had captured the entire session in perfect detail, including her face clearly visible as she spray painted my door at 3 in the morning. When I called the police, they arrived to find her still on my property, attempting to photograph her own graffiti as evidence of code violations. Officers, "This structure is in clear violation of municipal safety codes," she announced with the confidence of someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. "I'm documenting hazardous conditions for the safety of our community." Officer Williams, the same man who'd arrested her this morning, just shook his head. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for vandalism, trespassing, and filing false government documents." The look of bewildered outrage on Barbara's face as the handcuffs clicked shut was the moment Pine Hollow finally started healing from 3 years of trauma. The criminal charges came fast and hard: trespassing, vandalism, harassment, filing false documents, and a dozen other counts that carried serious prison time. Barbara's attorney tried to paint her as an overzealous volunteer trying to maintain property values, but the prosecution had 18 months of documented evidence showing a pattern of criminal behavior. When residents testified about their experiences with her harassment, the courtroom heard stories that sounded like something from a totalitarian regime rather than a suburban homeowner association. "Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "the defendant didn't just abuse her authority, she used it as a weapon against the very people she was supposed to serve." The 3-year sentence brought collective relief to Pine Hollow, but Barbara's imprisonment created an unexpected problem. With their dictator gone, the community discovered that their HOA was essentially rudderless. The other board members had been enablers rather than leaders, and without her iron fist holding everything together, the association began to crumble. "Who wants to live in a neighborhood famous for producing the most notorious HOA president in state history?" one realtor asked, and unfortunately, the answer was nobody. Property values plummeted, houses sat empty for months, and Pine Hollow began to look like a community in terminal decline. That's when I started making some strategic investments. With house prices at rock bottom and motivated sellers everywhere, I began purchasing properties throughout Pine Hollow, not to become some kind of slumlord, but because I saw an opportunity to help rebuild the community on better foundations. I bought houses that had been abandoned by families fleeing Barbara's toxic legacy, renovated them carefully, and rented them to people who were looking for a peaceful place to live without constant HOA harassment. Most of my tenants were refugees from other heavy-handed homeowner associations, people who appreciated the freedom to paint their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. By the time Barbara's release date was approaching, Pine Hollow had transformed into something completely different from the community she'd left behind, and she had no idea how dramatically the balance of power had shifted while she'd been counting days behind bars. Barbara's arrest this morning was just the opening act. What you're about to witness is a woman so delusional that 3 years in prison couldn't shake her belief that Pine Hollow still belonged to her. Over the next few days, I watched from my cabin as Barbara, now released on bail pending her parole violation hearing, began what could only be described as a ghost queen's attempt to reclaim her imaginary throne. The woman who'd been tackled into my rhododendrons was somehow convinced that her dramatic return had been nothing more than a minor setback, a temporary inconvenience before resuming her rightful place as Pine Hollow's supreme ruler. The first sign of Barbara's disconnect from reality came Tuesday morning when she attempted to call an emergency HOA board meeting. I watched through my kitchen window as she stood on the sidewalk outside her house, frantically dialing numbers on her phone with the desperate energy of someone trying to resurrect the dead. "This is Barbara Henderson, your HOA president," I could hear her saying from 50 feet away. "We need an emergency session to address the Mitchell situation immediately." The conversations were brief, very brief. 20 minutes and 10 phone calls later, she stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at her phone with the bewildered expression of someone whose servants had forgotten their place. Her shoulders sagged for just a moment before she straightened them again, jaw set with the stubborn determination of someone refusing to accept the obvious. Wednesday brought Barbara's door-to-door intimidation campaign, clipboard in hand, attempting to remind Pine Hollow of their obligations under HOA regulations that existed now only in her imagination. The performance was both fascinating and pathetic, a dethroned dictator trying to govern subjects who no longer recognized her authority. Mrs. Patterson hid behind her living room curtains. The Johnsons simply didn't answer their door despite their car being in the driveway. And the new family at 43 received her mailbox lecture with polite confusion before quickly closing their door. Barbara made notes on her clipboard after each encounter, her face growing more flushed with each obvious dismissal. but she pressed forward with the mechanical persistence of someone following a script that no longer applied to reality. By Thursday, the subtle signs of Pine Hollow's transformation began penetrating even Barbara's fortress of denial. The houses around her displayed details that didn't match her memories. Identical deadbolt locks suggesting coordinated security upgrades, mailboxes bearing unfamiliar names, landscaping that showed the relaxed diversity of people who gardened for pleasure rather than compliance. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty as she processed these changes, but she pushed the observations aside like inconvenient facts that could be dealt with later. The woman walked through the neighborhood like a ghost clinging to rules that no one else remembered, her clipboard clutched like a talisman against the growing evidence that her kingdom had evolved beyond recognition. The breaking point arrived Friday afternoon when Barbara discovered that every door in Pine Hollow had been closed to her. Her master key, the one that had once granted access to every common area, failed at the community center, the pool gate, the mailbox cluster, and the maintenance shed. Each locked door represented another small death of her authority, but Barbara rattled every handle with increasing desperation, as if enough physical force could restore her vanished privileges. "They changed everything," she muttered, her voice carrying the hollow echo of someone talking to convince herself as much as anyone listening. "Conspiracy, that's what this is. They're trying to lock me out of my own neighborhood." The possibility that Pine Hollow had simply moved on without her seemed too devastating to acknowledge directly. Standing in the empty community center parking lot, surrounded by facilities that had once been the instruments of her power, Barbara finally showed cracks in her imperial facade. Her clipboard hung forgotten at her side as she stared at the chained doors with something approaching genuine confusion. This was a woman who'd built her entire identity around controlling other people's lives, who'd derived genuine pleasure from making families afraid to plant flowers or paint shutters without permission. The locked doors represented more than inconvenience. They were proof that her subjects had learned to function without their queen, had discovered that communities could maintain standards without living in constant fear of arbitrary punishment. What Barbara couldn't comprehend was that Pine Hollow's evolution hadn't been an act of rebellion against her. It had been an act of healing from her. The residents she'd terrorized had spent 3 peaceful years remembering what it felt like to live without measuring their grass with rulers or checking approved color charts before buying mailbox paint. They'd discovered that property values could be maintained through genuine community pride rather than fear-based compliance, that neighbors could resolve disputes through conversation rather than citations. Her kingdom hadn't been conquered. It had simply outgrown the need for a tyrant. The transformation was visible in ways both large and small, though Barbara's narcissism prevented her from recognizing the signs. Children played in yards without their parents constantly monitoring for potential violations. Residents chatted over fences without glancing around nervously for clipboard-wielding authorities. Gardens bloomed in creative arrangements that reflected personal taste rather than regulation compliance. Pine Hollow had become an actual neighborhood instead of a suburban prison camp, but all Barbara could see was chaos where her order once reigned supreme. Her worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that people might be happier, that property values might be higher, that community harmony might be stronger without her iron fist maintaining control. As Friday evening approached, I watched Barbara return to her house with the defeated posture of someone beginning to suspect that reality might not bend to her expectations after all. She walked like a woman carrying invisible weight, her clipboard now hanging loose in her grip, her imperial confidence replaced by something closer to desperate confusion. But knowing Barbara as I did, I was certain this was just a temporary retreat while she regrouped for whatever desperate measure she'd attempt next. The woman who'd vandalized my cabin rather than accept her limitations wasn't going to surrender her delusions without a much bigger fight. 3 years in prison had taught Barbara patience, but it hadn't taught her wisdom. She'd spent every day behind bars planning this return, imagining her triumphant restoration.